Let's talk about the fact that Star Trek and comedy are not necessarily something you immediately associate. In fact, it was Gene Roddenberry who, after seeing a rough cut of Trouble with Tribbles, said famously or infamously that Star Trek is not a comedy. And it was partially what led to, oh my God, Corey from San Diego Comic-Con is here. How about that? Well, I thought you only go to San Diego. Look at that. Okay. You see a familiar face for all our many panels in San Diego Comic-Con. And it infamously led to Gene Kuhn sort of partially, the reason he left the show was him and Gene fighting over, how comedic is Star Trek. So my question to you, Darren, is how comedic should Star Trek be?
I think Star Trek should be as comedic as it ever got on the original series. Now, this is a little different than how comedic it got in the movies, and specifically the original cast movies. The thing about the comedy in the original series is that it was always in service of the character, not making fun of the character. Even with all the goofy things that happen in Piece of the Action, for example. It's not because our characters are doing something stupid. It's because our characters are merely, fish out of water. And they're trying their best because they're really good at what they do. But contrast that with how the characters are acting in Star Trek 4, when they're absolutely idiots. I mean, Kirk and Spock can barely get on a bus, right? And this is just sort of
making... What does exact change mean?
I mean, even addled, brain-removed Spock knows what exact change means. I mean, he still knows how to speak, doesn't he? I mean, Q, tell me, you're prosecuting and judging this panel right now. That's correct, isn't it? I mean, mankind is better than that, and Star Trek is better than making fun of our characters.
David?
Wait, you didn't like Star Trek 4? Is that what you said?
Actually, I don't.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I'm the bad guy.
I just got chills.
Let's bring Nick Meyer out.
Please do.
I kind of agree with Aaron. I don't agree about Star Trek 4. I think that there's a different thing. There's a different reason Star Trek gets associated with comedy, because a lot of the original series is bad.
Oh, you know what? You ain't seen nothing yet in terms of me hating something.
I wrote a line in my Futurama episode where Fry, the main character, is trying to... Star Trek's been outlawed in the future, and he's trying to get Leonard Nimoy's head to admit he was on Star Trek, and he says, 79 episodes, about 30 good ones. And I think that there's there's a big chunk of Star Trek that is overacted and overdone, and it's one of the reasons why it gets spoofed so much. Is not the good Star Trek doesn't get spoofed. Tribbles really doesn't get spoofed. City on the Edge of Forever does, but Spock's brain. I mean, it's bad.
Spock's brain doesn't mean to be spoofed.
But it's funny. It's funny looking back on it. But I mean, I agree with what Darren's saying that when the show took itself seriously and played comedy, it worked. Trouble with Tribbles, the stakes of Trouble with Tribbles is Kirk might get in trouble, like with his boss. Like those are the emotional stakes of that show, and he's worried about his job, and that sort of connects Trouble with Tribbles with The Office. Like that's where the comedy of that show comes from, because everybody in it is playing it dead seriously.
So, David, could Nils Barris have been a character on The Office?
I don't see why not. He could work. This is working.
He was the Michael Scott of the 23rd century.
He could definitely work for Dunder Mifflin Corporate if they need him. It's interesting though, and let me just say, I love Star Trek 4.
Too many people do.
I just wanted to say, going back to the beginning, from the first pilot of Star Trek, The Cage, with Jeffrey Hunter as the captain, I think William Shatner coming in and what he added to the role, like just his charisma and just that he kind of could bring comedy. I think that gave so much and let them have personalities.
Right.
And I think that, that contributed a lot to the comedy that fit within the TV series and in the movies.
That's a great point, because Jeffrey Hunter was never a laugh riot.
It's among Shatner's first lines is he's jabbing at Spock. Terrible having bad blood like that. I mean, that's funny. He brought that sort of devil-may-care kind of attitude that makes it a little more fun.
I think that, to me, the biggest thing with Star Trek and comedy is that as a fan, like even when the stakes are crazy, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, when the ship has just been attacked, people have been slaughtered, and all of a sudden, they're like, where are these coordinates that lead to? We can beam down to this, this asteroid in space, and Bones says, what if those coordinates lead nowhere? And Kirk says, well, then this is your chance to get away from it all. And it's that levity, I think, that undercuts and it's enjoyable,
Well, I want to ask Jesse about that, specifically about Shatner's facility with comedy and screwball comedy. But before I do that, I realize it's been over 10 minutes and I've not plugged my book yet. So I want to make sure, since I failed to introduce myself at the beginning of the panel, you wouldn't know I've been doing these for 20 years. I'm Mark A. Altman, author of The 50-Year Mission, which has been on sale for the last year. It's a history of Star Trek, an oral history of Star Trek.
2 volumes.
And I won't sit here and talk about how great it is, but I will talk about greater minds than I, such as your partner in crime, Seth MacFarlane, and of course, Jesse Alexander's quoted here as well as book listed in Publishers Weekly. But I'm very proud of these books, and if you haven't read them, I hope you will check them out. And you can get them wherever books are sold.
They're amazing books. I just gotta say, the second one in the series that talks about Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Enterprise and stuff is one of the best books ever about creating and writing and just building a television series.
I'm all out of cash. You realize that? I spent it all on the dealer's room.
Incredible.
But thank you for saying that. And, it does also cover briefly Free Enterprise, which was my brush with finding out what a genius comedy Shatner was. Because when we hired him to do Free Enterprise, he was doing bad Jeff Speakman movies at the time. It was really before Third Rock.
That's redundant.
Third Rock from the Sun and all that kind of stuff. And we really felt like the Shatner we'd seen on Fridays and Saturday Night Live, that he was a brilliant comedic persona, and a large part of him doing that movie because it was a chance for him to be funny. Now, part of that was we heard him sing "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds," so we knew how funny to be, inadvertently or not. But Jesse, my question for you is, was a large part of the success of Star Trek, Trouble with Tribbles, I Mud, Piece of the Action, Shatner, and is it a reason you think that the later shows didn't do? I mean, Next Generation really doesn't have a great comedic episode. If you look at Voyager, there's not a significant comedic episode. And I'll ask David about why sort of Enterprise never, really dives into the comedy well.
For me, the Shatner I love Shatner. The original series is the greatest. I love it like crazy. But one of the reasons he's so funny is because he has Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley, and there's that, for me, the holy trinity emotionally, and the way that they interact with each other. There's a warmth and humor and relatability and relevance to the way that I think a lot of us interact with our own friends and families. So I think there certainly are the jokier parts of Star Trek, like, maybe Harry Mudd is a little out there, or some of that stuff. And I just wrote Harry Mudd in Discovery, so which is super cool. But I think also just the humor part of it is the way that, for me, those 3 guys interacted with each other, and the way that they could be warm and loving and still kind of screw with each other, and that for me grounded that show in something that I recognized.
Yeah. And now, I would ask you certainly about the comedy and Enterprise issue, but also it's ironic because people don't think of Star Trek as a comedy, yet when you ask somebody who's never seen Star Trek, what episode should I watch to get in the show? More often than not, people will say Trouble with Tribbles. Sometimes they'll say City on Forever, but most often they'll say Trouble with Tribbles is the episode you should watch. And, it's so associated with Star Trek, and yet people say Star Trek isn't a comedy.
Well, I think that the reason the sequel series never really went to comedy is because they were it started off with Roddenberry, and Roddenberry didn't want to do comedy, and McBurman really did want to carry on that that tradition. Like, he was very serious about carrying on Roddenberry's view of things. So I think that was the main problem, honestly, that they weren't ever going to address it that way. And certainly, I mean, they hired me on Enterprise because they thought they wanted to do more comedic episodes, and then I got there and it was clear they didn't. And maybe they didn't think I was funny. But that they were locked into a format that didn't allow, in certain ways, the original series was creating the format, and they tried lots of different things because nothing like that had ever been done. And there was a lot more, interestingly, a lot more experimentation because you had freelance writers coming in and pitching, and those they would write a script, and then you had Gene Kuhn, who clearly had a facility for comedy that he was injecting a lot of it into the show. And then once the sequel series came around, I think, and you know more about this than I do, but I think that they were sort of locked in to a perceived format that Roddenberry had, and that then his successors carried on.
Absolutely, and while we're talking about comedy and Star Trek, it's been a while since I mentioned my book. Comedy, obviously, in Star Trek is so much a part of pop culture. One of the legendary Saturday Night Live skits is not only Shatner's "Get a Life," which is sort of a brilliant sort of parody of Star Trek conventions, but the original Jim Belushi skit. Where the what?
John Belushi.
Did I say Jim Belushi? You don't know how brilliant Jim Belushi can be. I saw him in Twin Peaks; he was great. But no, in John Belushi, brilliant skit in the early mid 70s. That's how much Star Trek comedy is a part of popular culture. In The Office, you, David, had mentioned Battlestar Galactica became something very popular, but it was originally going to be Star Trek that Rainn Wilson, ironically, would have been obsessed with.
Well, I mean, it's not so much that he originally, when I met with Greg Daniels at the beginning of the series, I had seen the pilot, and there's a $6 Million Man reference in the pilot. Steve Carell does a $6 Million Man impression, runs bionically, and we had just talked about things that Dwight would like, and it was clear that Star Trek was fit into his universe. And I said, oh, that's even too cool for Dwight. Like, he needs something even smaller, niche, like Battlestar Galactica. But it's I think that there are a few Star Trek references throughout The Office, and certainly, I mean, it's interesting. Like, they're both like ensemble shows. The Office, in a sense, you have this crew. Have you guys ever seen the kind of mashups where you see like the cast of one show and then they're in uniforms and stuff like that? And I've seen one of The Office where they're like the Simpsons, to run like the Simpsons, and I know I've seen them as Star Trek characters.
Well, you had that chance with Futurama, David, to sort of do a love letter to Star Trek, but at the same time do something very funny. And it never fell into parody. It really was sort of an ode to what you loved about Star Trek, and it's still, hysterical without being insulting.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about where that came from and how you ended up doing that.
I mean, I think the sort of things you're talking about, I mean, Star Trek sort of passed into popular culture in a way that it has this kind of familiarity to people who aren't even Star Trek fans, because it's so huge. So many people watch Star Trek who, there are those of us who are giant fans, but it spreads out from there. Plenty of people have watched Star Trek just because it was on and it was good, and so then when you the kinds of stuff that I did in the Futurama episode was really referencing, some of the things that have been parodied so much. So Kirk's facility with women, which has been sort of, parodied so much because and if you watch Star Trek, and this goes to something people were talking about Shatner and his acting, even when there's no lines of dialogue where Kirk is flirting with a woman, he's flirting with a woman. Like, the look, he's got this look, and he's looking at him, and it's like, there's no dialogue.
It's called
there.
the male gaze.
and that ends up being something that you end up making fun of. but in a very sort of sweet way, because again, it's why we love to watch. I mean, you're sort of taking those things that end up getting parody, but you're not saying he's a terrible actor, although sometimes he is. But you know, and I think that's sort of the line you walk. It's like you celebrate it without insult.